Wehrmacht signals, intercepted US coordination, then realized 10,000 vehicles moved like one unit, October 7th, 1944. The concrete bunker outside Aachen trembled slightly as American artillery conducted another systematic bombardment of German positions. Inside, hunched over a crackling receiver in the dim light of a single electric bulb, Hauptmann Werner Vogel of the Wehrmacht Signals Intelligence Section pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. For 3 hours, he had been monitoring American radio traffic, and what he was hearing made absolutely no sense according to everything German military doctrine taught about radio communications. Vogel was 28 years old, a signals officer from Dresden with a degree in electrical engineering from the Technical University. He had served with distinction in Poland, France, and 2 years on the Eastern Front before being assigned to signals intelligence work in the West. He understood radio communications intimately. He knew their limitations, their vulnerabilities, their proper tactical employment. The German military had spent decades developing radio doctrine that minimized transmissions, used complex code systems, and strictly limited who could broadcast to prevent enemy interception and triangulation. The Americans, he was discovering, followed none of these rules. They broadcast constantly, apparently without concern. Their transmissions were clear, systematic, and utterly prolific. What disturbed Vogel most was not the volume of transmissions, but their content and organization. He was listening to American units coordinate movements with a precision and scale that should have been impossible using radio communications. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Convoy Baker 37 to Supply Depot forward. The American voice crackled through his headphones in accented but clear English. Approaching checkpoint Delta 4, ETA 1400 hours. Cargo manifests Sierra November 2 through 29. Request fuel allocation for return journey. Vogel quickly transcribed the transmission, his hand moving automatically across the paper, while his mind raced to comprehend the implications. Before he could finish, another transmission followed. Supply depot forward to Convoy Baker 37. Roger your traffic. Checkpoint Delta 4 confirms visual. Fuel allocation approved. Bay 7 cleared for your arrival. Unloading crew standing by. Then, almost immediately, another voice on the same frequency. Convoy Charlie 15 to Supply Depot forward. Delay at Checkpoint Charlie 2 due to bridge repair. Revised ETA 14:30 hours. Cargo manifests Tango Hotel 5 through 17. The responses came with mechanical precision. Every transmission was acknowledged. Every convoy seemed to know exactly where it was going, what it was carrying. The Americans were coordinating what sounded like hundreds of vehicles across a network that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, and they were doing it openly, systematically, with an organizational precision that exceeded anything Vogel had witnessed in 4 years of monitoring enemy communications. He reached for the field telephone to call his commanding officer, Oberstleutnant Hans Dietrich, who commanded the Signals Intelligence Detachment for the 7th Army. This was the 4th consecutive day that Vogel had detected similar patterns in American radio traffic, and the scope was growing larger with each monitoring session. Something fundamental had changed in American operations, and Dietrich needed to understand what it meant. Within 30 minutes, Dietrich arrived at the monitoring station, accompanied by Major Friedrich Kessler, the 7th Army's logistics officer. Both men had been summoned because what Vogel was reporting seemed to contradict every assumption German planning had made about Allied capabilities. "Play me what you've intercepted," Dietrich ordered, settling into a chair beside Vogel's monitoring station. For the next hour, Vogel played recordings and provided live monitoring of American radio traffic. The pattern was unmistakable and deeply troubling. The Americans were operating what appeared to be a massive, coordinated supply network that used radio communications as its central nervous system. Convoys reported positions regularly. Supply depots acknowledged arrivals and departures. Traffic control points coordinated movements. Medical stations reported casualty numbers. Maintenance units requested spare parts. Fuel depots tracked consumption rates. Everything was broadcast, recorded, acknowledged, and apparently acted upon with systematic efficiency. Kessler, the logistics officer, listened with growing alarm. His face, already lined with the stress of trying to supply German forces with inadequate resources, grew progressively more troubled as the transmissions continued. Finally, he interrupted. "How many distinct call signs have you identified?" he asked Vogel. "In the past 72 hours," Vogel replied, consulting his notes, "we have identified 247 unique convoy call signs, 38 supply depot designations, 62 checkpoint identifiers, and numerous medical, maintenance, and command posts. The traffic suggests continuous operations involving thousands of vehicles." "Thousands?" Dietrich repeated, his skepticism evident. "Surely you must be intercepting the same units repeatedly. They're using multiple call signs to create the impression of greater numbers." Vogel shook his head. "Herr Oberstleutnant, I considered that possibility. But the cargo manifests they report are all different. The checkpoint confirmations place them at different locations simultaneously. The timing of arrivals and departures makes it impossible for the same units to be in multiple places. And most importantly, they're transmitting on dozens of different frequencies, using what appears to be standardized radio equipment." He pulled out a chart he had been maintaining, showing frequency usage patterns over the past week. "The Americans are operating coordinated radio networks across multiple frequency bands. Each network appears to handle different types of traffic. One network for convoy movements, another for supply depots, another for medical transport, another for maintenance coordination. They've created an entire communications infrastructure that treats radio not as a limited tactical tool, but as standard operational equipment." The three German officers sat in silence as the implications settled over them. German doctrine, developed through hard experience, taught that radio communications were inherently vulnerable. Every transmission could be intercepted by the enemy. Every radio position could be triangulated and targeted. Therefore, radio use had to be minimized, restricted to essential command communications, and protected through complex encoding systems and frequent frequency changes. The Americans appeared to be operating under completely different assumptions. They broadcast constantly, apparently unconcerned about interception. Their transmissions were often in clear language, using only basic brevity codes. They coordinated massive logistics operations over radio networks that German forces could barely maintain for tactical combat communications. "This is either spectacular incompetence," Dietrich said slowly, "or we have fundamentally misunderstood American capabilities." Kessler, whose responsibility was understanding Allied logistics, spoke with the grim certainty of someone reaching an unwelcome conclusion. "It's not incompetence. We've been reporting for months that American supply operations exceed our projections. Now we're seeing how they accomplish it. They've turned radio communications into an operational system, not just a tactical tool. They're coordinating supply movements on a scale we literally cannot match because we don't have enough radios, enough operators, or enough institutional trust in the technology." The monitoring session that October day was not an isolated incident. It represented the beginning of a comprehensive German intelligence effort to understand American communications capabilities that would, over the following months, reveal a disparity so vast it challenged fundamental assumptions about how modern armies operated. The story of how Wehrmacht signals officers discovered, analyzed, and ultimately despaired over American radio coordination capabilities was not merely about technology. It was about two fundamentally different approaches to organizing military power in the industrial age, and about German officers gradually realizing that their side had chosen the wrong approach. To understand why American radio coordination shocked German signals officers so profoundly, we must first understand what German forces were working with in October 1944. The Wehrmacht's radio communications system had been designed in the 1930s based on lessons learned from World War I and the Spanish Civil War. German military theorists correctly understood that radio was a powerful tool, but they also believed it was inherently vulnerable and therefore had to be used sparingly. German military radios in 1944 consisted of dozens of different models, produced by multiple manufacturers, each designed for specific purposes. The Standard Infantry Division relied primarily on the Feldfehl B field telephone system, using wire communications whenever possible, and radio only when absolutely necessary. When radios were employed, they used models like the Tornister Empfänger E, a backpack receiver, or the Feldfehl F, designed for short-range tactical communications. These radios were adequate for their designed purpose, but they had severe limitations that shaped how German forces operated. The Torn EB, a typical German infantry radio, weighed approximately 40 pounds, required 2 men to operate effectively, had a maximum range of about 5 kilometers under ideal conditions, and needed regular battery replacement. More powerful radios like the 15-watt transmitter could reach farther but were complex, temperamental, and available only to senior headquarters. German tactical doctrine emphasized radio silence whenever possible. Units were instructed to use radio only for urgent tactical communications that could not be transmitted by wire or messenger. This doctrine was reinforced by Germany's experience fighting Soviet forces, who had proven quite effective at radio intercept and signal intelligence. The psychological impact of this restrictive doctrine was profound. German officers at all levels viewed radio as a tool of last resort, something to be used when no other option existed. The idea of broadcasting routine logistics information over radio networks seemed recklessly insecure to officers trained to minimize electromagnetic emissions. Major Werner Pluskat, whose unit defended the Normandy beaches, later wrote about German radio doctrine with the perspective of someone who had experienced its limitations firsthand. We were taught that radio discipline was essential to survival. Every transmission could be intercepted by the enemy. Every broadcast was a potential death sentence if it allowed the enemy to locate your position. Therefore, we used messengers whenever possible, telephone wire when we could lay it, and radio only when we had no alternative, and the information was urgent enough to justify the risk. This doctrine, while theoretically sound, created severe practical limitations. German units often could not coordinate effectively over distances exceeding a few kilometers. Supply movements relied on pre-planned schedules rather than real-time coordination. Changes in operational requirements took hours or days to communicate through the chain of command. The system worked adequately when operations went according to plan, but it collapsed rapidly when faced with fluid, fast-moving situations. The Americans, Vogel and his fellow signals intelligence officers were discovering, operated under completely different assumptions and with completely different equipment. The standard American military radio in October 1944 was the Signal Corps Radio SCR-536, a vehicle-mounted frequency modulation radio that represented a quantum leap beyond anything in German service. The SCR-536 produced up to 40 watts of transmission power, far exceeding most German tactical radios. It could operate on any frequency between 20 and 28 MHz, allowing flexible frequency assignment without changing crystal oscillators. It featured frequency modulation technology that provided clearer communications and better resistance to interference than the amplitude modulation systems used by German radios. Most critically, it was designed for continuous operation and was mounted as standard equipment in thousands of American military vehicles. American military planners had made a fundamental decision that German planners had not. They had concluded that the advantages of radio coordination outweighed the security risks of transmission. This decision was enabled by America's vast industrial capacity, which could produce radios in quantities that made equipping every vehicle practical, and by American organizational philosophy, which emphasized coordination and information sharing over secrecy and compartmentalization. By October 1944, the U.S. Army had fielded approximately 130,000 SCR-536 radios across all theaters of operation. Western Electric, one of multiple manufacturers, was producing these radios at a rate exceeding 2,000 units monthly. Each radio cost approximately $450 to manufacture, a significant sum but one that American procurement could easily afford given the vast military budget. The SCR-536 was not alone. The Americans had developed an entire family of standardized military radios, each designed for specific purposes, but all sharing common design philosophies and, where possible, interchangeable components. The SCR-510 was a portable backpack radio with superior range compared to German equivalents. The SCR-619 was a vehicle-mounted high-frequency radio for longer-range communications. The SCR-300 was a shorter-range radio for infantry use. Specialized radios existed for aircraft, tanks, artillery forward observers, and naval vessels. What shocked German signals officers was not merely that these radios existed, but that they existed in such vast quantities and were employed so systematically. The Americans had not just built better radios, they had built an entire communications infrastructure that treated radio as standard equipment rather than specialized technology. Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt, a signals officer captured near Metz in November 1944, underwent interrogation by American intelligence officers. His interrogators, noting his technical background, spent considerable time discussing radio communications. Reinhardt's responses, preserved in Allied intelligence reports, revealed the profound difference in scale and philosophy between German and American approaches. Asked about German radio equipment, Reinhardt explained that a standard German infantry regiment might possess perhaps a dozen radios total, most of them short-range tactical sets. Long-range communications between regiments and division headquarters relied primarily on telephone wire, laid by signals personnel and vulnerable to artillery fire. When wire was cut, as happened constantly during intensive operations, communications broke down until repair crews could restore connections. His interrogators then described American radio deployment. A typical American infantry regiment, they explained, possessed over 100 radio sets of various types. Every company had multiple radios. Battalion and regimental headquarters operated extensive radio networks. Support units, including artillery, engineers, and logistics, all possessed dedicated radio equipment. The entire regiment could coordinate its movements through radio communications without relying on vulnerable telephone wire. Reinhardt's response was captured in the interrogation report. "That cannot be correct," he insisted. "The number of radios you describe would require hundreds of trained operators, vast quantities of batteries and spare parts, and coordination on a scale that would be impossible to maintain. You must be describing your entire division's radio allocation, not a single regiment." The interrogators assured him the numbers were accurate and offered to demonstrate. They arranged for Reinhardt to observe an American regimental command post in operation. What he witnessed during that demonstration affected him profoundly. The command post operated multiple radio networks simultaneously. One network connected the regiment to division headquarters, another coordinated between battalions, a third handled artillery support requests, a fourth managed logistics coordination. Operators rotated through shifts, maintaining 24-hour communications without interruption. Reinhardt watched for several hours, observing the constant flow of information. Unit commanders reported positions and status regularly. Artillery fire missions were coordinated in real time. Supply requests were transmitted and acknowledged within minutes. Changes in orders were disseminated immediately to all affected units. The entire organization functioned with a level of coordination that exceeded anything he had experienced in German service. In his subsequent debriefing report, submitted after his return to Germany following the war, Reinhardt wrote with painful honesty about what he had observed. "The Americans have turned radio communications into something we never imagined possible. They do not treat radio as a specialized tool for emergency use. They treat it as the fundamental nervous system of their military organization. Every unit is connected. Every commander can communicate with higher headquarters, adjacent units, and supporting elements continuously. This level of coordination allows them to operate with a flexibility and responsiveness that we simply cannot match with our communications systems. Back at his monitoring station outside Aachen, Hauptmann Vogel was reaching similar conclusions through systematic analysis of intercepted traffic. Over the course of 2 weeks in October, he and his team recorded over 1,500 American radio transmissions. They catalogued call signs, frequencies, transmission times, and message content. The resulting analysis painted a picture of American operations that was both impressive and deeply troubling. The Americans were operating what Vogel termed a logistics radio network that coordinated supply movements across hundreds of kilometers. This network appeared to handle routine, non-tactical traffic that German forces would never broadcast over radio. Convoy positions, cargo manifests, fuel consumption rates, maintenance requirements, all transmitted openly with minimal encoding. Vogel's analysis identified several key characteristics of American radio coordination. First, standardization. The Americans appeared to use identical radio equipment across thousands of vehicles and installations. This standardization meant every operator was trained on the same equipment, every maintenance technician could repair any radio, and every supply depot stocked the same spare parts. German forces, by contrast, operated dozens of different radio types, each with unique training requirements and maintenance needs. Second, systematic procedures. American radio operators followed rigid communication protocols. Every transmission began with call signs. Every message was acknowledged. Every report followed standard formats. This systematization reduced errors and ensured that critical information was never lost due to miscommunication. German radio operators, working with more limited equipment and restrictive doctrine, often used abbreviated procedures that saved transmission time but increased the likelihood of misunderstandings. Third, continuous operation. The Americans maintained radio networks around the clock, 7 days per week. Vogel's monitoring logs showed American transmissions at all hours, suggesting multiple shifts of operators working to maintain uninterrupted communications. German radio operations, by contrast, often scaled back during nighttime hours when operations slowed, and junior personnel capable of maintaining communications during off-peak periods were scarce. Fourth, integration with operations. American radio traffic was not merely communication for its own sake. It was integrated directly into operational processes. Supply convoys reported to checkpoints, which updated traffic control, which adjusted routing to avoid congestion. This level of dynamic coordination required not just radio equipment, but organizational systems designed to use the information being transmitted. Vogel prepared a comprehensive report for his superiors in early November. The report, captured by Allied forces in March 1945 and now preserved in military archives, represents one of the most detailed German analyses of American communications capabilities produced during the war. The Americans possess a communications infrastructure that exceeds German capabilities by an order of magnitude, Vogel wrote. This advantage is not merely technological, though their radio equipment is superior to ours in range, reliability, and ease of operation. The advantage is systemic. They have organized their entire logistics operation around continuous radio coordination. They have trained thousands of operators. They have standardized equipment and procedures to enable this coordination. Most critically, they have embraced radio communications as an enabling technology rather than viewing it as a necessary vulnerability. He continued with observations that cut to the heart of Germany's strategic predicament. German military doctrine emphasizes security through silence. We minimize radio transmissions to prevent interception and triangulation. This doctrine made sense when radio equipment was scarce and operations were conducted over limited geographic areas. It fails catastrophically when facing an enemy who can coordinate thousands of vehicles over hundreds of kilometers through real-time radio communications. The Americans accept the security risk of transmission because they have calculated, correctly, that the operational advantages outweigh the intelligence vulnerabilities. Vogel's report included a devastating comparison. Based on his monitoring, he estimated that American forces in Western Europe possessed at least 100,000 military radio sets of all types. German forces, including all branches across all fronts, possessed perhaps 25,000 radios total. The disparity was approximately 4-to-1 in absolute numbers, and far worse in practical terms, because American radios were more powerful, more reliable, and more systematically employed. The report concluded with an assessment that senior German officers found almost impossible to accept. American logistics superiority, which we have attributed primarily to their vast industrial production and excellent road networks, is enabled and enhanced by their communications infrastructure. They can coordinate supply movements that we literally cannot monitor or control using our available communications equipment. They operate at a tempo and scale that our logistics system cannot match, not merely because they have more trucks, but because they can coordinate those trucks more effectively than we can coordinate our more limited transport resources. Oberstleutnant Dietrich forwarded Vogel's report up the chain of command, adding his own cover letter that emphasized the implications. If Hauptmann Vogel's analysis is accurate, and I believe it is based on my own review of intercepted traffic, then we face an adversary whose organizational capabilities exceed our own in fundamental ways. This is not a gap we can close through tactical excellence or operational brilliance. This is a systemic advantage rooted in industrial capacity and institutional philosophy that we cannot overcome with our available resources. The response from higher headquarters came 3 weeks later and revealed how difficult it was for senior German commanders to accept these conclusions. The report from Hauptmann Vogel is interesting but likely overstates American capabilities through overinterpretation of intercepted traffic, wrote a staff officer at OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command. American radio discipline may appear lax because they are inexperienced in combat operations. Their prolific transmissions likely represent inefficiency rather than systematic coordination. We should not mistake quantity of transmissions for quality of communications. This response, preserved in captured German documents, revealed a profound disconnect between officers analyzing intelligence in the field and senior commanders responsible for strategic decisions. The field officers, monitoring American operations directly, understood they were witnessing something genuinely unprecedented. The senior commanders, insulated from frontline reality and psychologically invested in German technical superiority, interpreted the same evidence through a filter of preconceptions that prevented accurate understanding. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Vogel was not the only German signals officer reaching alarming conclusions about American capabilities. Major Friedrich Hartmann commanded a signals intercept company attached to Army Group B. His unit's mission was monitoring Allied communications to provide tactical intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. By November 1944, Hartmann's analysis was producing intelligence that his superiors found almost impossible to believe. Hartmann's unit operated multiple monitoring stations across Western Germany, intercepting American, British, and Canadian radio traffic. Through systematic analysis, his team had identified a pattern that seemed impossible according to German understanding of military communications. The Americans were operating what appeared to be a coordinated network linking thousands of vehicles across a geographic area exceeding 100,000 square kilometers. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Different monitoring stations, separated by hundreds of kilometers, intercepted traffic from convoys reporting to the same supply depots. Checkpoint identifications appeared in transmissions across multiple frequencies and geographic locations, suggesting a unified traffic control system. Cargo manifest numbers followed sequential patterns that implied centralized coordination. Most tellingly, the Americans were broadcasting traffic updates, route changes, and priority assignments that reached multiple convoys simultaneously through what appeared to be dedicated logistics frequencies. Hartmann prepared a detailed map plotting every convoy position, supply depot, checkpoint, and maintenance facility. his unit had identified through signals intercept over a 30-day period. The map, which survived the war and is now displayed at the U.S. Army Transportation Museum, showed American logistics operations spanning from the Channel Coast to the German border, involving an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 vehicles in continuous movement. This cannot be correct, General der Panzertruppe Heinrich von Luttwitz declared when Hauptmann briefed him on the analysis. No army in history has coordinated 10,000 vehicles over such distances. You must be intercepting traffic from all American units in the theatre, not just logistics operations. Hauptmann stood his ground, pointing to specific evidence. Herr General, these transmissions explicitly identify themselves as supply convoys, not combat units. They report cargo manifests of fuel, ammunition, and rations. They communicate with supply depots, not tactical headquarters. They request fuel allocations and maintenance support, not operational orders. This is logistics traffic, and it operates continuously on dedicated frequencies separate from tactical communications. Von Luttwitz studied the map for a long moment before responding. If your analysis is accurate, we are not fighting an army. We are fighting an industrial system that has organized itself for warfare. No military force in history has possessed this level of logistical coordination. How do we defeat an enemy that can coordinate supply movements with greater efficiency than we can coordinate combat operations? The question hung in the air, unanswered because there was no good answer. The brutal mathematics were inescapable. If the Americans could coordinate 10,000 supply vehicles through radio networks, they could sustain offensive operations indefinitely, regardless of distance from their supply bases. German forces, unable to match this coordination capability, would be constantly outmaneuvered and outsupplied. The systematic nature of American radio coordination became even more apparent when German forces captured intact American radio equipment. In December 1944, during the opening phases of the Ardennes offensive, German troops overran several American supply depots and captured numerous vehicles equipped with SCR radios. Hauptmann Erich Schneider, a signals officer attached to the 6th Panzer Army, was ordered to examine captured American radio equipment and assess its capabilities. What he discovered during his examination exceeded his expectations and deepened his understanding of why American communications were so effective. The SCR 536 radio, which Schneider examined in detail, was a revelation in military radio design. The radio was housed in a sturdy metal case designed for vehicle mounting. All controls were clearly labeled in English with simple, intuitive operation. The frequency selection used a direct reading dial that allowed operators to select any frequency within the radio's range without changing crystals or performing complex calculations. The power output could be adjusted for different range requirements. Most impressively, the radio included a built-in power supply that could operate from vehicle electrical systems without requiring separate battery packs or generators. Schneider tested the captured radio using a German military vehicle's electrical system. After making simple adaptations to the power connections, the radio operated flawlessly, transmitting and receiving with excellent clarity on multiple frequencies. He conducted range tests and achieved clear communications over distances exceeding 30 kilometers under field conditions, far superior to comparable German tactical radios. What truly impressed Schneider was the radio's reliability and maintainability. The radio's construction used modular components that could be easily removed and replaced. Technical manuals, found with the captured equipment, provided clear troubleshooting procedures and maintenance instructions. Spare parts were standardized across thousands of radios, meaning any SCR 536 could be repaired, using components from any other unit. Schneider prepared a technical assessment that was forwarded to German signals authorities. The American SCR 536 represents the application of mass production principles to military radio construction, he wrote. This radio is not built for individual craftsmanship or technical elegance. It is built for reliability, ease of operation, maintainability, and production in vast quantities. Every design choice prioritizes practical military utility over technical sophistication. He continued with comparisons that were painful to German pride but necessary for accurate assessment. A German signals specialist requires weeks of training to operate and maintain our tactical radios competently. An American operator can be trained to operate the SCR 536 effectively in days. Our radios require skilled technicians for repairs. American radios can be maintained by operators with basic technical training using standardized spare parts and clear technical manuals. We build radio equipment for specialists. The Americans build radio equipment for soldiers. The philosophical difference extended beyond individual radio sets to the entire communications infrastructure. German military communications were organized hierarchically, with radio equipment allocated based on unit importance and operational necessity. American communications were organized systematically, with radio equipment allocated based on functional requirements regardless of hierarchy. In practical terms, this meant that a German infantry regiment might possess a dozen radios, controlled tightly by senior officers and allocated to priority communications. An American infantry regiment possessed over 100 radios distributed throughout the organization, allowing every company and many individual platoons to maintain independent communications. The American approach created redundancy and flexibility that German forces simply could not match. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Speidel, who served on Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's staff before Rommel's forced suicide in October 1944, later wrote extensively about German observations of Allied capabilities. In his post-war memoirs, he addressed the communications disparity with unusual frankness. "We German officers prided ourselves on our tactical sophistication and operational art," Speidel wrote. "We developed elegant battle plans and executed them with precision when circumstances allowed, but we fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. The Americans did not need tactical elegance. They needed systematic coordination of overwhelming resources. Their radio communications infrastructure allowed them to achieve this coordination at scales we literally could not comprehend, much less match. The disparity in communications capabilities created cascading effects throughout military operations. American forces could coordinate air support, artillery fire, and ground maneuvers in real time through integrated radio networks. They could adjust supply priorities dynamically based on changing operational requirements. They could redirect logistics movements to avoid congestion or respond to emergencies. They could maintain command and control over widely dispersed forces operating across vast geographic areas. German forces, limited by communications constraints, operated more rigidly. Air support requests required complex procedures and often hours of processing time. Artillery fire had to be pre-planned because coordination was difficult. Supply movements followed fixed schedules that could not easily adapt to changing conditions. Command and control became tenuous when units were separated by more than a few kilometers. The result was that American forces, even when inferior in tactical skill or equipment quality, could outmaneuver and out-coordinate German forces through systematic application of superior communications. A German unit might win individual engagements through superior tactics, but American units won campaigns through superior coordination and sustained operations. By January 1945, as German forces retreated across the Rhine following the failed Ardennes offensive, Wehrmacht signals officers had developed a comprehensive understanding of American communications capabilities. That understanding, documented in numerous reports and analyses, painted a picture of systemic American superiority that senior German commanders found profoundly demoralizing. The Americans possessed approximately one radio set for every 6 soldiers in their combat forces, compared to German ratios of approximately one radio per 50 soldiers. American radios averaged higher power output, longer range, and better reliability than German equivalents. American operators were trained systematically in dedicated signal schools, while German operators often received abbreviated training due to manpower shortages. Logistics provided steady supplies of batteries, spare parts, and replacement equipment, while German logistics struggled to maintain even essential radio operations. Most critically, American military doctrine integrated radio communications into every aspect of operations. Radio was not viewed as a specialized tool, requiring careful rationing. Radio was viewed as the fundamental infrastructure that made modern mobile warfare possible. This philosophical difference, more than any specific technical advantage, explained why American forces could coordinate operations at scales that German forces found impossible. Oberst Wilhelm Meyer, Chief Signals Officer for Army Group B, compiled a comprehensive assessment of Allied communications capabilities in February 1945. His report, one of the last major German intelligence analyses produced before the final collapse, represented the distillation of months of monitoring, analysis, and painful realization. The Allied forces, particularly the Americans, have developed communications capabilities that exceed our own by factors that make meaningful comparison almost impossible. Meyer wrote, "This advantage is not primarily technological, though their equipment is superior. This advantage is systemic and institutional. They have organized their entire military structure around continuous radio coordination. They have invested in training, equipment production, and operational procedures that treat communications as infrastructure rather than capability." He concluded with an assessment that captured the despair of officers who understood how completely Germany had been outmatched. "We cannot close this gap through tactical innovation or operational brilliance. The disparity is too vast, too fundamental, too deeply rooted in industrial capacity and organizational philosophy. We are fighting with the communications systems of the previous war. They are fighting with systems designed for the scale and tempo of modern industrial warfare." The outcome was never in doubt once this disparity became clear. The story of Wehrmacht signals officers discovering American radio coordination capabilities was not merely about technology or tactics. It was about the collision between two fundamentally different approaches to organizing military power in the industrial age. Germany had developed an approach that emphasized secrecy, hierarchy, and careful rationing of advanced technology to elite units. America had developed an approach that emphasized coordination, systematic distribution of adequate technology throughout the force, and institutional trust in the value of information sharing. When these two approaches collided on the battlefields of France and Germany, the outcome was determined not by which side had better tanks or more courageous soldiers, but by which side could better coordinate the application of its resources. The Americans, through their systematic approach to radio communications, could coordinate supply movements involving thousands of vehicles, coordinate artillery fire across entire fronts, coordinate air support in real time, and maintain command and control over forces dispersed across hundreds of kilometers. The Germans, limited by communications constraints that were as much philosophical as technical, could not match this coordination even when their individual units performed with tactical excellence. They fought brilliantly in countless small engagements, but they lost the larger war because they could not organize their resources as effectively as their enemies. For Werner Vogel, sitting in his monitoring station outside Aachen in October 1944, the realization had come gradually but inevitably. Every transmission he intercepted, every convoy he tracked, every supply network he mapped added another piece to a picture he did not want to see but could not deny. The Americans had not just built better radios, they had built an entire system for coordinating modern warfare that Germany, for all its tactical sophistication and technical prowess in some areas, had failed to develop. That system, more than any individual weapon or any single battle, would determine the war's outcome. The trucks that rolled day and night across France and Germany, coordinating their movements through radio networks that German forces could monitor but not match, carried more than supplies. They carried proof that systematic organization and institutional investment in coordination infrastructure could overcome tactical brilliance and individual technical excellence. They proved that in modern industrial warfare, the side that could better coordinate its resources would prevail, regardless of who possessed better tanks or more skilled soldiers. The final months of the war brought the full weight of American communications superiority into devastating focus. As Wehrmacht forces retreated into Germany proper, their own communications infrastructure collapsed under relentless Allied bombing, while American radio networks expanded and strengthened. Hauptmann Vogel, evacuated to a monitoring station near Dresden in March 1945, witnessed the final act of this communications drama. His monitoring equipment, now powered by unreliable generators due to electrical grid failures, still intercepted American transmissions with crystal clarity. The Americans were coordinating what he estimated were 15,000 vehicles across Western Germany, broadcasting supply priorities, route changes, and operational updates without apparent concern for German intercept capabilities. The irony was crushing. German signals intelligence could hear everything the Americans were doing, but Germany lacked the resources to act on that intelligence. Knowing that an American supply convoy would pass through a specific location at a specific time meant nothing when German forces lacked the fuel to position intercepting units, lacked the ammunition to engage effectively, and lacked the communications equipment to coordinate any response. In his final report, dated April 10, 1945, Vogel wrote with the clarity of someone who no longer cared about diplomatic language or protecting superior officers from uncomfortable truths. We have spent this entire war believing that German technical excellence and tactical sophistication would overcome Allied numerical advantages. We were catastrophically wrong. The Americans understood something we did not. Modern warfare is won through systematic coordination of adequate resources, not through individual technical brilliance. Their radio networks coordinated 10,000 vehicles more effectively than our systems coordinated 10 vehicles. That disparity, multiplied across every aspect of their operations, determined this war's outcome before most battles were ever fought. Major Hauptmann, whose signals intercept company had tracked American logistics and networks across Western Europe, was captured by American forces near Kassel in early April. During his interrogation, he asked his American captors a question that revealed how profoundly the experience had affected him. "How many radio operators did you train during this war?" The interrogating officer consulted records before responding. Approximately 280,000 Signal Corps personnel were trained for various communications specialties. "Why do you ask?" Hartmann's response was recorded in the interrogation report, because Germany trained perhaps 30,000 signals specialists during the entire war. You trained nearly 10 times as many communications personnel as we did. That single statistic explains more about why you won than any analysis of battles or weapons. You understood that coordination was as important as firepower. We never grasped that truth until it was far too late. The German signals officers who survived the war carried their knowledge into the post-war period. Many were interrogated extensively by Allied intelligence officers eager to understand what Germany had learned about Allied capabilities. Others wrote memoirs or contributed to military historical projects. Their collective testimony painted a consistent picture of systematic German failure to understand the scale and nature of modern industrial warfare. Oberstleutnant Dietrich, who had supervised Vogel's monitoring work, wrote in 1948 for a U.S. Army historical project. "We German officers believed radio communications were a necessary vulnerability to be minimized through strict radio discipline. The Americans understood radio communications were an enabling capability to be maximized through systematic investment. That philosophical difference, more than any specific technical factor, determined the war's outcome. They built an infrastructure for coordination. We built individual pieces of equipment. Infrastructure defeated equipment, as it always does, in industrial warfare." The technical assessments produced by captured German signals officers proved invaluable to American military planners developing post-war communications doctrine. The German analyses, written by competent engineers who understood both German and American systems, provided external validation of American approaches while identifying areas for improvement. Hauptmann Schneider, who had examined captured SCR radios, was employed by U.S. Army Signal Corps after the war to provide technical assessments. His reports emphasized that American success came not from revolutionary technology, but from systematic application of adequate technology at unprecedented scale. The lesson for future conflicts, he wrote, is that systematic deployment of good equipment throughout the force defeats concentrated deployment of excellent equipment in elite units. The legacy of American radio coordination extended far beyond World War II. The Korean War, Vietnam War, and all subsequent American military operations built on foundations established in 1944 and 1945. The principle that every unit should possess organic communications capabilities, that radio networks should operate continuously, that coordination infrastructure matters as much as combat power, became embedded in American military doctrine. Modern military communications, with satellite links, encrypted digital networks, and real-time data sharing, represent the direct evolution of principles proven in France and Germany during World War II. The specific technologies changed dramatically, but the underlying philosophy remained constant. Coordination enables effectiveness. Information sharing enhances combat power. Communications infrastructure is as critical as any weapon system. For the Wehrmacht signals officers who witnessed American capabilities firsthand, the experience provided lessons that transcended their immediate military context. They had seen how institutional investment in infrastructure could overcome tactical excellence. They had witnessed how systematic organization could defeat individual brilliance. They had learned that in modern industrial warfare, the side that better coordinates its resources prevails regardless of who possesses superior individual capabilities. Werner Vogel, who survived the war and became an electrical engineer in West Germany, rarely spoke publicly about his wartime service. But in a 1978 interview for a documentary about Wehrmacht signals intelligence, he reflected on what monitoring American radio traffic had taught him. We intercepted thousands of their transmissions. We knew exactly what they were doing, but knowing changed nothing because we lacked the systemic capabilities to respond effectively. They had built a coordination infrastructure we could not match. That infrastructure, more than any weapon, won the war. It was the most important lesson of my military service, and the one German commanders were most reluctant to accept. The Americans had not merely defeated Germany through superior numbers or industrial capacity, though both mattered enormously. They had defeated Germany through superior organization, superior coordination, and superior understanding of how modern warfare actually functioned in the industrial age. The radio networks that Werner Vogel monitored in October 1944, coordinating movements of thousands of vehicles with systematic precision, represented that understanding made operational. They proved that in modern warfare, the ability to coordinate resources matters as much as the resources themselves. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.